just going to go ahead and get right into it because judging by the title of this episode, y'all know it's about to go down. I don't nearly have enough time to talk about this as I want to, but I figured I would come on here to elaborate more on this very important issue that came up. So to give you some background, I posted a TikTok not too long ago. Like at this point when this video is coming out, just like a few days ago, I kind of interrupted my episode schedule to kind of insert this one just because it was so timely to what was happening like in my other platforms and stuff. So I posted a TikTok about my paper that I'm writing for grad school, and the paper was very much about this. I'm going to grad school to be a school counselor, so this is all from the realm of a school counselor, from the lens of a school counselor. And the paper was about the role of a school counselor on an IEP meeting. That was like the basis of the paper. Like, what do counselors do in IEP meetings, right? And I'm already a special education teacher right now. Like I have training and practice and a license in special education. So I had emailed my professor and I was like, hey girl, I didn't start like that, but I wanted to. I was like, hey, I am already a special education teacher. I would like to, expand my horizons a little bit on this paper so I can actually get something out of it, not necessarily just like what a counselor is supposed to do. Because as a practicing special education teacher, like I was already pretty confident in what a counselor should do on an IEP meeting. So instead, I had asked her, I was like, hey, I can research some other topics and I can still go in the realm of special education, but I would like to, expand my horizons a little bit as opposed to just like talking about the counselor's role in a typical IEP meeting. Like what other research and data is available for us there, right? So I decided to focus on this idea of the overrepresentation of Black, Indigenous people of color within the IEP process. So there's this research that I've done that very much encompasses this, basically this systemic racism that overrepresents people of color into the special education process. And I, obviously being in education for, 10 years at this point, being a professional educator for 10 years, like I have known about it, but I've never actually taken the time to do the research. So this paper, I was really curious about it, right? So I obviously care a lot about this topic. I obviously am interested in doing this kind of work. So I posted a TikTok and I was like, hey, working on a paper about this. What are your hot takes? What are your thoughts? And the way that it kind of blew up, now it didn't go viral by any means, but like I had thousands of comments about teachers who have experienced this in their own classrooms. I had comments about, other people who have done this research. I've had people suggesting resources. And what really happened there was like a conversation really opened up. And I was like, hey, like we need to have this conversation. This is a very important conversation to have. But in the TikTok comment section is not a great place to have that conversation, right? So I was like, okay, how do I extend this conversation? I plan on doing a conference for this paper. I plan on presenting it at a counseling conference in the near future, probably sometime next year. My professor said it was like, fine. And I think she said it was good enough to present. So that's actually really cool. I'll get more into that in a second or a little bit later. But the idea here is I wanted to open up a forum and a conversation for this very important topic because not only is it super timely given, the state of the world, but also given just like the state of education and where it's at. And it's always been like that, right? I think the first line of my paper is as of 2014 data, this is still an issue, right? So that's 11 plus years in the making. And I know there are resources that I'll talk about, and I know there are resources that I'll talk about that are very much geared towards, the 70s and the 60s and like way early on within education and like where it came from, right? So there's a lot out here, and the way I wanted to start this conversation is literally just by saying like, hey, first of all, like I'm not an expert on this, right? I have done research, I've looked at resources, I have a lot of training in teaching. I've been teaching, like I said, for 10 years. I have a master's degree in English education. My first degree, my bachelor's degree is in English education. I have a special education license, and then I'm halfway through my counseling master's, so as a school counselor. So I have been involved and I am knowledgeable about the current research and trends within education, but that does not make me an expert on this particular topic. Like I have not devoted nearly enough time that I feel like I want to in this particular topic, literally just this 4-page paper that I wrote that I'll get into in a second, right? So I just wanted to open it up by saying like, yes, I am in education, like I have grounds to have these conversations and I have grounds to know about these, to establish like my ethos there, but I am by no means an expert, right? So if we're looking for someone who's like an expert on the topic, this isn't it. I'm literally just one to open up the conversation for some more, for some more discourse, because that's the whole point here, right? I have been trying, for those of you that are watching visually, you can see my cat is like barely in the frame. I had to put his bed right next to where I'm recording because he always tries to get in my way. I like do grad school at this desk when I'm on like, online classes, and I, obviously record my podcast here, and he's always like jumping up on me and stuff. You guys have seen it in the other videos. So I was like, what if I just like put his bed right here? So he's chilling next to me, but he keeps trying to like get closer. He's so clingy, bro. So anyway, I'm going to try not to let that be a distraction. So with that, I did want to start with like some personal stories that kind of engaged my passion with this before I even knew it was something that I am passionate about, right? Like when I started in education, like I didn't know that this would be such a hot button issue. And I did want to start by saying like my teaching training in my undergrad. So obviously I went to a university to get my undergrad degree in education. And I think my professors were the people that like impacted my life the most, not only in education, but just like in the general thought of things, right? Like they expanded my levels of empathy. They expanded like my knowledge of the world. They more so developed my teaching philosophy and my personal philosophy towards people more so than any other teacher or professor I had in my entire life. So my professors in English education, if by some realm of the world you are listening to this, like thank you so much, because literally I would not be the teacher I am or the person I am today without their like guidance in that initial part of my career and my profession. So with that said, like the thing that they really stressed more so than ever was like, I'm not an English teacher. I am a teacher of people, right? So they stress like, yes, you have to know the content, you have to know what you're teaching, but English has this like very niche representation within education where it's like you can connect to students, you can connect to the world, you can connect to culture, and the idea in that is really representing that we do not teach English, we teach people in development is what they would always say, like people in training. And that was the philosophy that really guided our teaching program, is that we are teaching the people first, we are student first, we are all of these things before we are teachers of English. And having that mentality kind of driven into my head, and like, a mentality that I obviously agreed with is something that definitely guides this whole realm of conversation. So as we talk, like I do want you to understand that like my teaching philosophy is very much rooted in the fact of like we are teaching people, and we are teaching people to be the best version of themselves. And we do that through how we engage in the classroom. And I've done a lot of things in education, but English is like my base, my home base, right? That's the thing I'm most comfortable with, the thing I've done forever. And, I always think about that process where it's like, hey, yeah, we have our content, we have our specialties, but at the end of the day, we are teaching students, right? So I did want to start off with a personal story here. And that personal story is related to some students that I've had in the past and some experiences I've had. So I do want to say that like most of my teaching experience comes from a public charter school, and I know that there are opinions about a charter school and what it represents and what it is for people, but most of my experience comes from there. And I maybe we'll do a video or a podcast or an episode or whatever I want to do at this point that really focuses on my experiences at the charter school, because my experience wasn't in the system of the charter school wasn't bad. My experience with the people in charge of the charter school were bad. And if you've been following along, you know that. So we don't have to get into that right now. But anyway, I keep skirting this idea of like a personal story, right? So our charter school at the time was very non-diverse, for lack of better words. It was majority students that are white, right? So we had maybe 10% or less minorities within the system, students of color in the population. So we were very much new to that. The school's been around for only 25 years, so it's relatively new, but it exists in a city that is highly diverse. And we were kind of like an enigma within the school district of saying like, oh, we're not a very diverse school. So there's a lot of work for them to do still in that community, but that's the frame of reference through which I am designing this conversation. So I was having a conversation with a student in my first summer as a teacher. So this is after my first year of teaching. I was working in the credit recovery program. So for those of you who don't know about the credit recovery program, in all schools, in all public high schools, they have a credit recovery program. And the credit recovery program is meant for students who have failed classes that are working on getting their credits back so they can work towards graduation. That is the whole goal with that. So as we are thinking about, students who are failing, as we are thinking about what the credit recovery program stands for, the credit recovery program is really just to make sure every kid gets graduated. And in that, I was talking to a kid, and I, was kind of shy because some other teacher was running this. Like, I didn't want to step on her toes. I didn't want to do all these things. So I was kind of just like, kind of like tiptoeing around, basically, like, student teaching type energy, observation type energy that I was just engaging with in my initial parts of that credit recovery program as it happened in my first, summer as a teacher, right? So I, eventually sit next to this kid and I get to know him for a little while, and he starts talking to me about how he wants to switch schools. And I'm like, okay, like, why do you think you want to switch schools? And he was like, I don't know, it's just like, this is too hard, like I failed all my classes, like everything like that. And I was like, no, you can definitely like do it, like that's what we're here for, right? Like we're here to move you to graduation, to like support you in that. And I was like, is there anything else? And he's like, nah, I guess not. And it's just like, okay. So we're talking about that for a while, and he talks about like, oh, I want to transfer like to the public high school that's down the street or whatever, is closer to my house, all these different things. And as I engage with him more and like the conversation more, eventually he says this thing that I have never forgotten. And this was 11 years ago at this point, 10, 11 years ago at this point, like my very first summer teaching. And he says, after I, get to know him a little bit more and after I engage the conversation more, I'm like, so like, why do you want to leave? It doesn't sound like you actually want to. Like there's something that's holding you back that you want to talk about, And he looks at me and he says, Mister, there are no other brown kids here. And the way that I heard it in his voice and the way that I saw him react to that and the way that, like I said, it still impacts me to like this very day. The fact that this kid wanted to trade schools because he does not see himself represented in any other people in the school. He does not see his culture represented. He does not see his demographic represented. He doesn't see any of himself represented. And literally that's all he had to say was that, Mister, there are no other brown people here. I want to go somewhere where there are people like that. And that was the reason that he switched schools or wanted to switch schools. I don't think he ended up switching schools. I don't remember that part, to be completely honest, but that was 10 years ago. It was the summer of 2017, I think. So 8 years ago, whatever. 8 years ago, yeah. And the way that that has impacted like my teaching journey, not only at that school, but just in general, is literally, I can't even tell you, it's priceless to me, that conversation and the meaning that I derive from that conversation. And that's kind of the reason I am where I am today. And this is maybe a conversation for later too, but the credit recovery program at my school, I consistently challenged for this because most of the kids who were minorities were students in credit recovery. If you looked at the demographics, and I have this data somewhere, I definitely collated this data somewhere at my old school in my email, so they probably deleted it or changed it or whatever. I wish I would have made a copy of it, to be honest. But the credit recovery demographic data was so skewed to students of color that did not fit the demographic of the school that it was eye-opening to me to look at that. It was scary for me to look at that, to say that like, oh, so only the brown kids are failing, only the black kids are failing. Right? It wasn't the white students in our school. It was literally the minority students, those BIPOC students that were failing their classes more often than all of the other white students. And data speaks, right? We're going to get into that, but that data I brought to people so many times, and they were like, oh yeah, well, what can we do about it? And I was like, what do you mean, what can we do about it? And this first story of the student really just goes to like show that truth, right? Like I engage with students of color in credit recovery more so than I did like in my general teaching, just because it was unfortunately concentrated within that credit recovery program. And I advocated for that for the 10 years that I did credit recovery, because I took it over from then, and every semester it was a new batch of data, and I was like, oh cool, more brown kids that were failing at this school. And that continued, right? There are other students that were unrightfully punished and put into ISS more often. There was one student towards the end of my, career at that school that was in 7th grade and acting very much like a 7th grader, but because he was black, he, was sitting in ISS so often. I feel like every other week I was in the assistant principal's office, and I was like, girl, why is he in ISS again? What is he doing that is different from any of his other peers? And she said, he's getting more write-ups. And I said, okay, but he's getting write-ups for talking out of turn. He's getting write-ups for walking around the classroom, right? He's getting write-ups for things that other kids are getting write-ups for, but he's getting more attention for it. And why is that? It's not probably because it is because he was brown and he was a student of color in a very white school. And I had this conversation with admin, with counselors, and the fact that I was working to advocate for them and nothing was done is the reason I'm getting heated, I can tell, is the reason that I'm going to the school counselor's realm, because I connected with these kids in a way that a lot of other people in the school did not. And many people told me that. They were like, oh, you connect with kids that don't traditionally succeed in school. And I'm like, they're not traditionally succeeding because they're not a traditional student to you. It's a student that doesn't look like you. It's a student that doesn't look like the students you're teaching. And that's why you're struggling. And that was an issue to me. And I worked really hard to make sure that those kids had a place to exist, a place to complain about it, and a place to advocate for themselves. And like, Kassick, like, we don't deserve this. And I was like, I know you don't. And it's super frustrating. And let me tell you about the conversations that I've had with people. And I'd hope that those students realize that, but I also hope that the people I worked with also could vouch for that, because those students were in my room all the time because of the fact that they were not being treated the way that their peers were, just because they were of color. And that's my personal kind of connection to this, right? Is like, I have seen this in education for a decade, and I have witnessed it at that school specifically, but even at the school I was at, recently, right? Like, the data is skewed. Like, the data is just skewed. Like, students of color are more, in ISS, they're getting more referrals. They are getting in special education a lot more. And I'm going to go into more conversations about that when I get into my paper. But my personal connection to this is that I have seen it happen, and that I have advocated for it since that summer, where that student looked at me and said, "Mister, there are no other brown kids here." It breaks my heart. My first school read a book. They had what they called like an equity team, and the whole goal of this equity team was to make sure that as our school got more diverse, is we were working towards, and I fully supported this idea. I wish I could have been on the team at the time, because of the fact that I had, speech and debate and yearbook and all these different things that I was doing, and credit recovery that I was running, and I was advocating for equity in a different way. I wasn't able to be a part of the team. But the equity team very much was meant to have these conversations. I think at the end of the day, there was like 7 or 8 consistent teachers, which in the grand scheme of things is not enough, right? Like, I wish there were more. They were given, 20 minutes at a time, 30 minutes at a time in professional developments that we used to have like every other month or whatever. And they were given time. Was it enough time? I would say absolutely not. They should have been given days of conversation, because of the fact that that conversation was more important than, the other conversations we were having at PD. So did they get enough time to do all the things they needed to do? Absolutely not. I don't know what it's like now, and I'm glad that the equity team existed in that capacity, but the fact is they didn't nearly get enough time for the work that we needed to do. And I think that speaks volumes of like just the logistics, that like hidden curriculum that I'll get into in a future episode about what are we telling our staff, what are we telling students if we don't actually devote time to fixing this issue. And I think just giving that team, this very important equity team that's working towards, trauma-informed education and culturally responsive education, right? We are showing them that by giving them only 20 minutes is that the people in charge don't care enough about this, because there are more important things to attend to. And that's insane and wild to me, that the logistics itself proved that there wasn't enough time, that we don't care about this enough because we're only devoting this little amount of time to it. Like I said, things can be different right now, but this is how it was based on the experience that I had. And not even that it matters that it's different for me, because I'm not in that system anymore. For them, I hope it's different, right? And They read a book, which I'll talk about a little later in the resources, is Courageous Conversations About Race. And I think it's Glenn something that wrote it. I'll jump back to that in a second. And the idea here is like, how do you have conversations about systemic racism and about systemic oppression in education? And that book was supposed to be a good guide. I have personally not read it yet. I think it's on the shelf behind me. And it's one of those books that does matter in these conversations, because it is giving leadership an idea of how do we begin to make changes. And I think any school that is willing to have a book study about that, to lead a team, is on the right track. And, I want to give credit where credit is due. And like, more schools should have that kind of system in place. They should realize that like, there is a hole here, there is a lacking support here, and we need to figure out how to do it. And we often do that through creating teams, through creating a book study of sorts. And if you're interested in doing that, highly recommend that book. And there's some other books on the list that I would highly recommend, or even some, resources that I'm going to talk about that like, hey, if you want to start an equity team at your school, here's a bunch of resources. Like I said, I'll get into that. So I think that kind of establishes like my passion towards this topic, and I hope that comes through in a positive light, right? Like someone on TikTok called me out for, you know, being a white savior or whatever, and I think that is not accurate. That's not what I feel like. I think I'm doing my best in advocating for all students and what all students need. But the fact that I can come in and be like, those movies, they're like Freedom Riders, I think is one of the ones that people always mention, where it's like, oh, give me all the attention, give me everything that I need because I'm going to be the one person that leads them into this system and helps them do that. Like, I'm not trying to do that at all. I'm trying to provide a forum for the conversation, and I'm trying to advocate for the individual student because that is the thing that needs to happen. We need to be having these conversations, right? Like, I'm not putting myself on a pedestal because I also have work to do. And I think acknowledging my own biases and acknowledging my own implicit biases, explicit biases, even, right? Like, acknowledging that it's like I still have work to do is a part of it. And I think that a lot of people push that off, right? They don't want to acknowledge that, hey, maybe some things I'm doing are problematic. Maybe some implicit things that I feel and think are a problem, right? And I think working through your part in the system, it is systemic oppression and it is systemic racism for a reason. Like, it's so ingrained in the system, right? Like, I've done a lot of work clearly with this, and as a school counselor, like, there's a whole bunch of ethical standards and student standards that like lead you to needing to uncover your own implicit biases and to understand where they come from, right? And I think there is a lot of work that happens there. So any school that's willing to do that, right, and anyone that's willing to put in that work and acknowledge their own biases is on the right track. Nobody's perfect, but I also do want to reference that it's like, I understand that I'm white. Like, I don't have the authority here to say that this is how the system works. Like, it goes back to that expert piece, right? Like, I understand that I'm a white man. I understand like my place in the conversation. I understand that there's potential conflict there. I understand that I will never be able to understand what a student of color goes through in the system because I never was that. I never was a student of color in public education. That's just a fact. And I can have empathy and I can, level with a student and I can give them a safe space to listen, but I will never understand the way that the system has impacted them. And that alone is a piece that is something that more people, more administrators, more educators, more teachers need to come to terms with, and saying like, hey, I cannot ever understand what you are going through because I have never been in that place. And that is the place from where this conversation stems from, is how do we acknowledge these biases? How do we acknowledge our role in the system? And how do we acknowledge where to grow from here? And all that is about is opening up a conversation. So when I post a TikTok or when I post a conversation about this, the whole point is discourse, right? Like, I want to be called out. Like, call me out if I'm doing something wrong, right? Like, that's the point. And it's uncomfortable, it's conflictual, it's demanding of us to be the leaders here, to call people out in conversations, but that is the point, right? Like, I acknowledge the fact that it's uncomfortable, but we need to be uncomfortable if we're going to change, because change doesn't happen overnight. Change doesn't happen, with something that like, oh, I'm going to stay in my little bubble forever and I'm never going to move out of it and I'm going to stay here forever and never ever move. That's not how change happens, right? Change happens by moving forward, and we move forward sometimes we need a little push. And I think a lot of people in society and in education right now need a little push to recognize that it's like, these are the changes we need to make and these are the conversations that we need to have. And of course, I say this sitting here knowing that as a counselor, every time I think about having these conversations, my heart rate goes up a little bit, right? Because I don't know how to have these conversations yet with people. Like, I don't know how to call someone out when we're, sitting in the teacher's lounge, we're talking about a student, we're like, oh yeah, he's a tough one, and it happens to be a student of color. I don't know how to call them out and say like, hey, is it the student that's tough, or are you just having a trouble with that they're of color and they don't look like you, right? Like, how do we know when to interject in those conversations? How do we know how to have that conversation with a colleague? How do we know how to have it respectfully? How do we know how to have it with the goal of saying, we are not trying to have conflict just for the sake of conflict, but we were trying to have conflict for the sake of moving forward. And I think that's what these resources that I'm going to talk about are geared towards, right? It's how do we change the way we teach? How do we change the way we talk to each other? How do we change the way we talk about students? And I think these are all guidelines to how we improve and how we get better. And I think acknowledging that one, there is a problem. There were some of those comments that kind of were pushing aside the fact that there is a problem. They're like, it's not about color. And I was like, actually it is. Actually, it kind of is about color, unfortunately. I wish it wasn't. I wish you were right. I wish it wasn't. But it is, because if you go back to how society was, someone made a comment, and I wish I remembered, I don't remember who it was, but they were like, yeah, no, the system actually works really well for the people it was designed for. And it was designed for white people way back when, you know, they did the gerrymandering, they cut up the districts, they cut up the counties based on where they wanted people to live, right? Like, it goes so deep that there's no way that it ever hasn't been about race. And we just built society off of that, you know, that system that was inherently racist. And people are like, oh, it's about, you know, it's about poverty and it's about access to things. And it's like, okay, poverty is also kind of racist because it's the structural racism that put them in that place, right? And basically everything you bring it back to, unfortunately, it is about race, and we have to acknowledge that, right? And I think acknowledging that it is, you know, you can, there was also another comment that I made a video about it. I'm not going to get into it here, but like I said, the whole point is, how do we learn to have conversations that challenge people and move us forward? How do we have conflict that makes us uncomfortable so that we can change? And that's the whole point of me even having this conversation on a podcast, me posting about it on TikTok, because it's like, if we just sit here and sit in it and not actively call our colleagues out and call other educators and teachers and administrators out, like, nothing's going to change, and these students are going to continue to be marginalized in a way that they don't ever deserve. Nobody ever deserves to be pushed to the bottom of anything. And that's what we're doing as a society, as educators. You know, the system is doing that. And I think it's those of us who want to work against it and want to have these conversations are the ones that are going to make a difference. And even in the state of society, even in the state of politics and government and education that we are, I think it's these people that are going to be on the right side of history, that are willing to have these conversations, that are willing to move things forward. And again, this is not to put me on a pedestal, right? Like I said, I want to be called out. If I'm doing something wrong, like, tell me, right? Like, that's how we change and that's how we grow. But the idea here is, like, if we're opening the conversation, that's how things will change. Let me get some water real fast. My bad. Anyway, the next step that I did want to talk about was very briefly just like the paper that I wrote. I also posted my paper onto TikTok. I don't know, because people were asking for it, and I was like, you know what, it's good. Like, let's share it. I want people to see, you know, and that also opened a conversation. And I think, you know, if they plagiarize me, whatever, I don't care. Like, I already turned in the paper. Like, it's not that serious. And the more people that are using the paper are saying the things that I want them to say anyway, so it's fine. But that is posted on my TikTok. So if you don't follow me on TikTok, like, Kassick's Corner on TikTok, and it's right there. It's pretty good. It's only 4 pages. You can read it real fast. Anyway, my paper, the title of it, like I said, so the whole point of this paper originally, the whole original point of this paper was to acknowledge, like, the role of a counselor within the IEP process, right? For a counselor to understand special education and our role in it, and, like, what an IEP is. And coming from someone who has been in education, who is a special education teacher, I know the process of IEPs pretty well. I've written dozens of them at this point, right? Not hundreds. I've only been a special education teacher for like a year. So, but I have written them. So I emailed her and I was like, girly, I don't want to write this paper. It seems like a waste of time. What can I do differently? She's like, do some research, see what you find. And so I gave her my idea, and my idea was like, hey, I kind of found this niche kind of topic that there is a lot of research on, but something I think, like, as a counselor, there's not a whole lot about, like, what the counselor should do to advocate for it. So I emailed her the idea that said, like, hey, I want to know the role of the counselor in advocating for students of color within an IEP meeting who are wrongfully put within the special education process. She was like, brilliant. If it's good, we'll write a conference about it. And I was like, please give me feedback, because I want to present at conferences. Hit me up. You know, if you want me to come yap at your school, I'm nobody right now. I'm just a guy, but, like, I'm funny. I can do it. I'm really good at presentations, you guys. Sorry, I just have to, my camera fell. My goal here is it's hard for me to advocate for myself and to show that I'm good at stuff. So that's what this is. Hey, call me. I can yap at your school. I can give a presentation. I'll present my paper. I'll make something. I'll come tell jokes. Anyway, let's just, the title of my paper is School Counselor Advocacy, Opposing Systemic Let me try again. I got too excited. I got too riled up with the first part of this conversation, and then I got silly goofy because like I was trying to balance it out. But now we got to get serious again. So the title of my paper is School Counselor Advocacy: Opposing Systemic Racism Through the IEP Process. So how I introduce this, right, is I kind of go through the American School Counselor Association like position statements, and I go through like data that basically says as of 2014, like I said before, as of 2014, students of color, people of color, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color students are the majority, right? Like they, not overwhelmingly, but they are the bigger percentage of public students at this time, public school students at this time. So the fact that they still are getting underserved is an issue because there are more of them than there are white people. And the fact that the hegemony still says that white people are basically getting more services and everything is a problem. So the position statements definitely, and this is where kind of the core of the argument comes from, is the position statements in ASCA, American School Counselor Association. They very much lead towards saying, yes, we need to support all students, we need to support all students on disabilities, and we need to advocate for culturally diverse populations, right? However, there is nothing in those conversations that give us ideas of this idea of double oppression, right? So if you are a BIPOC student and you are in special education, you are essentially double oppressed because of the fact that you are existing in two forms of marginalized groups, right? A marginalized group in special education, students with disabilities are marginalized, not necessarily equally, but they are marginalized, just as students of color are marginalized. They are not given the same opportunities as students who are, typical students, and that is just the system of society. That is the system of education, right? Like not both groups of these students are marginalized and are oppressed, right? So when we're talking about these opportunity gaps and this educational misrepresentation of these students, that is a form of oppression. The line literally in my last sentence of my intro paragraph says, opportunity gaps and educational misrepresentation is oppression. And then we can talk about this idea of students being double oppressed. Students with disabilities are a cultural group. That's a lot of the conversations, right? Like neurodivergent students with, other disabilities through IDEA, through whatever other realm of disability can happen. They are a cultural group, and that is what a lot of the conversations are saying. I've done a lot of studies also as well on neurodivergence in a way that is represented through this concept, this overwhelming term of disability. So being in two cultural groups that are, essentially marginalized by the system, you are being double oppressed. And that is an issue within the School Counselor Association that there's not really a thing for, right? There's not really a statement that says like, hey, if you're a student that is double marginalized, double oppressed, then that intersectionality, right, is not really aligned. Because how do we advocate for a student of color who is in special education who does not need to be? And how do we advocate for the IUP process? How do we advocate for proper supports with a student of color and engaging them in that process? Because there is an overrepresentation of students of color within special education, and I'm going to get into that with the research that comes up. And this idea of there is no position statement, there is no standard, there is no guideline for supporting doubly oppressed students. And before I continue, I did think of something else that came up, and this will come up with the resources as well. There is a whole lot of conversation too about women, about girls in education not being represented in the way they need to be as well. Like, especially when it comes to special education and neurodivergence, women are, much more likely to be late diagnosed with things like autism and ADHD specifically, as well as other disabilities, are often overlooked because of the fact that they mask a lot better. Society, boys are also overrepresented in special education than girls. I think like my caseload last year was like 80-20, if I'm, being as general as I can be. I don't know the specific numbers, but the idea here is males are also overrepresented. And if you're a woman of color in special education, that's a triple oppression, right? Like if we're talking about it that way. So that is not to say, that's just not what this paper is about. And I'm going to get into that in the resources, but there is also other marginalizations that happen. And there is also other intersectionalities that exist within this conversation that I won't necessarily get into, unfortunately, just because, like I said, the realm, the scope of this paper is very limited. And this is a podcast, right? Like I can post more episodes, but like this one is it's just one. And I hope to have that conversation. So anyway, that aside, I did want to get into the overrepresentation of these BIPOC students, right? So in the specific categories they are overrepresented. So if you don't know anything about special education or IDEA, basically IDEA is a federal law. It's the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act that kind of defines the categories with which students can have a disability. And the way that they get a disability is through a significant educational impact. So, for example, like I was diagnosed like when I was 29 with autism, but I didn't have a specific or a significant educational impact when I was a kid, so no one really knew, right? But that is where we define special education services, is when it is a significant educational impact. I only threw myself out there because it's about me and I can make that distinction. So the following categories: specific learning disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and emotional behavior disorders, which is like the big one that I kind of focus on, is there is an overrepresentation of students of color within those three categories. And basically what that leads to is students aren't challenged, they aren't graduating, they have higher suspension and expulsion rates, they have higher rates of unemployment as they graduate from high school. And this is basically contributed to because of teacher bias. So a whole piece of this paper talks about like where this comes from, why students of color are overrepresented in education, in special education, and in behavior referrals, right? I told you I focus on that like emotional behavioral, disability category. And basically what it comes down to is most teachers are white. That's just how it is, right? And because of that, we have these like Eurocentric, like cultural mannerisms and cultural ethos and cultural, like, hegemony that basically says, I've used that word twice, hegemony. Anyway, that has this cultural, like this mainstream culture that is very Eurocentric. And when a student's behavior does not fit that norm, when a student's behavior does not fit that like idea of, let's sit quiet in class, let's, pay attention to the teacher, let's raise our hand when we speak, right? When they are not necessarily matching that Eurocentric behavior, when it is a different culture and they are, walking around the room and they're talking and they're engaging in conversations in a different way and they're like moving their hands and they have to move their bodies a little bit, right? Those are representations of a different culture that Eurocentric teachers, that white teachers often misrepresent as, misbehavior, because of the fact that it's like, hey, you're out of your seat. I talked about that with a student I talked about at the beginning of this podcast, right? Is he was getting written up so much because he was just doing behaviors that he is culturally appropriate, and teachers were like, nope, that's not allowed, he's not allowed to do that. And that is where this comes down to, right? Like the fact that there are more behavioral referrals from students of color is because of the fact that they don't match the dominant culture that is Eurocentric, that is very white. And that's why they are referred to higher levels of support, because I've seen this happen in every school that I've worked at and every school that I've seen and been a part of and traveled to when I was tutoring back then, right? Is the fact that these students aren't getting support because often teachers are saying like, I don't know how to help him, I'm going to put him off to a counselor, I'm going to put them off to a special education services, and I'm going to refer them elsewhere because I don't know how to deal with them. And that's where the problems come, right? Is because teacher referrals are the guiding force towards special education, towards MTSS support, towards all of these different like behavior supports, right? Is through the classroom teacher. And if that classroom teacher is unaware of like these cultural differences, if this classroom teacher is unaware of their own implicit biases in education, if this teacher is very much, stuck in their values and their cultural values and the things that they see as like normal and correct, then more students that are opposing those things are going to get higher referrals to these levels of support. And oftentimes these students don't really need them. They just need, a place to exist freely. And that's what it comes down to. Sometimes these students do need those supports, but that's a totally different conversation. We're talking about overrepresentation here, right? So counselors then have this role, and this is like an ethically supported goal through like all of the, ethical standards and like through the ASCA standards. We're talking about like counselors have this innate goal. And I didn't know this really about counselors because every school counselor that I've had in life and every counselor that I've worked with hasn't really emphasized this goal as I've been working with them, but they do really have this goal of advocacy to advocate for all students, especially students that are multicultural, right? Like counselors go through multicultural competence training. My class next semester is literally about multicultural counseling, and every book that I have read so far in counseling has a dedication to how do we include this with multiple different cultures? How do we be aware of our own biases in these things? How do we develop our counseling role through different cultures? So counselors in their innate role have a role in challenging and adjusting this educator bias, right? So that said, there is a lot of data that is supporting that even counselors are not well trained enough, right? And I haven't been a counselor ever, right? Like, so I don't have a frame of reference here, but a lot of the research that I found and a lot of the research that is saying is like even counselors don't have the multicultural competency that they need. And a lot of their biases and low expectations make an impact on the way they show up for students and the way they advocate for students. And that is innate in the problem as well, right? So this is the systemic issue is our teachers aren't getting multicultural training, our counselors aren't getting multicultural training, and our administrators likely are not getting multicultural training either. So if we have all of these leaders, all of these people within the school building that are not getting the training they need to work with people, of course our biases are going to be intact because we don't know how to deal with them, we don't know how to talk about them, we don't know how to identify them. And that is where the systemic issue lies, is we need people who are actively trained, and the research says that we don't necessarily have that yet. We are moving towards that, obviously, but we do not have that yet, and that is a big issue as we're talking about this, as we have this conversation, is the fact that we don't have teachers who are trained, we don't have educators who are specifically trained. There is this concept that really stuck out to me as I was having this conversation, as I was writing this paper, and it's talking about this idea of disregard, and it's talking about, I'm going to read the exact quote that I put. A concept discussed by Shell 2020 of disregard. The idea that the way to treat all students equally is to put on blinders to differences based on disabilities. Recalls similar societal practice of colorblindness, not seeing color. So there's this practice. Basically, what this is saying is there's this practice that says like, hey, like we're gonna help all students, and we're just we're gonna put on blinders to like their disability and how it shows up in the classroom because like we can support all students the same way. So basically, no matter what their disability is, we're just gonna like teach them the way that all students are taught, right? And as I kind of mentioned in here, there's this also like societal practice that's like, oh, I don't see color. And that is something that comes up a lot as we have this conversation. And this is something that I was called out on when I was doing an interview a long time ago. When I was first getting my teaching job at a school district, they were like, how do you teach a student who's of a different color than you? And I was like, oh, I just, treat them as I would any student. I would advocate for them in the same way. I would do all these things. And I remember getting called out. And at the time I was kind of upset about it, to be honest, because like I didn't understand it. But basically the woman interviewing me, and this is where this comes from, and this is related, I promise, about this idea of color blindness. She basically said, and in a different way, because the research has also grown since 10 years ago when she had this conversation with me, but she said like you have to be able to identify and acknowledge the student's color and that impact that they have on them, right? So by being colorblind, you are effectively deleting this piece of their identity that is very much changing and impacting the way that they have existed in the world. And that's what I talk about in this paper, and that's what the research is talking about, right? Like by ignoring a cultural identity through a disability or through race, you are significantly ignoring a piece of their identity. You're ignoring the whole person, you're ignoring their experiences, and you're ignoring their unique challenges. And when we have students of color who are over identified with disabilities, they are ignored like twice. They have there's a distinct like dual ignorance that happens where we're talking about like, oh, you're a student of color and you have a disability. We're going to ignore both of those things and just teach you like everyone else. And you can see that sounds kind of insane, right? To ignore these two very specific pieces of their identity, to ignore these two very specific pieces of who they are and what they need and what supports and advocates they need, and to just like put those off to the side. Like that is hugely problematic. And I think like that is the general practice. Is the general practice is saying like, let's just pretend that they're white and typical, right? And that's a problem. We can't just teach every student like they don't have a disability. We can't just treat every student like they're white. We can't just treat every student without identifying these pieces of their identity, because to ignore a piece of someone's identity is to ignore them. And that's not how we teach. So they talk about this idea of, services are services. Like if we're providing services, we're providing the thing we need. And unfortunately, I've seen that in special education as well, right? Where they have these like generic accommodations that are put into IEPs that don't necessarily take into account the student and their specific need and their specific disability. And that is hugely problematic, right? Legally speaking, even, right? Like if you're not matching the student's needs, like that's a legal violation of an IEP. So anyway, the next thing that they kind of talk about in the research is this idea of like separate worlds. And this is more niche to like the education system and not necessarily talking about, tangential. It's tangential to what we're talking about, but it's this idea in special education of the IEP has their caseload and the counselor has their caseload, and there can be like no overlap. The Venn diagram is two different circles. There's nothing that overlaps, and that's problematic as well, because as I talked about this idea of like two identities, right? They have an identity as a cultural group with us as a student with a disability and as a student, of color that the counselor needs to advocate for. So the fact that they only get one advocate for two pieces of their identity is problematic, right? And I've argued this before in a lot of capacity in a lot of different papers actually recently, that students who are this like double oppressed demographic, who are like this intersectionality of identities where they need two advocates for two different things, they need to have overlap in those services, right? They need two advocates because they have two different pieces of their identity that are being repressed, that are being marginalized, and they can't succeed if they only have one. Like, as a special education teacher, I am very well trained in the legalities of the IEP. I'm very well trained in advocating for a student and their accommodations. I'm well trained in holding and practicing an IEP meeting, but I'm not necessarily trained as a special education teacher to advocate for the cultural needs of a student, to advocate for the social emotional needs of a student, to advocate for the identity needs of a student, right? I'm trained in all the pieces of an IEP and I can advocate for that. But the counselor on the other side is trained, supposedly, right, is trained in these multicultural things, is trained on that social emotional level, is trained to advocate for the identity of a student differently. So why would we only put the responsibility on one of those parties when the responsibility is both of theirs? So to say that there's this like separate world where it's like students on IEPs don't need a counselor to advocate for their services, yes, they fucking do, right? They need that support because they have two pieces of their identity that need advocating for, because there are two pieces of their identity that are actively oppressed and marginalized. And that is what the research is saying. The research is saying that there's two separate worlds, and I'm arguing that there should not be. We need collaboration. We need double advocacy. We need that piece of everything in order to overcome these systemic obstacles for these students. The last sentence of this paragraph is kind of good, so I'm going to read it. It says, students who are doubly oppressed require a double. Let me try again. I'm too fired up, bro. Students who are doubly oppressed require double advocacy to overcome systemic obstacles from the expertise of case manager and counselor. So that sets us up for the potential solutions I talk about in this paper, right? We're talking about, we clearly have this group of students who are, doubly oppressed because of their disability, because of their overrepresentation in special education, and because they are a student of color. And the potential solutions we have to this really comes down to this educational this like misalignment of educational trends, right? Like, there are solutions that these studies post, and these studies are really talking about like, hey, let's do restorative practice, let's do social emotional learning, let's do multicultural training, let's create safe places. Like, every study that I've looked at is like, hey, we have these things in place, like, why don't we do more of them? And I was like, girly, like, because these aren't working. They're not put in place correctly, which is why they're not working. And I'm going to do a whole episode on this. I alluded to this in my, season 2 opener, that there was an episode of Cult of Pedagogy recently that talked about the, discipline in schools and how it's kind of falling behind and how it's basically failing our students because of the fact that things are implemented so poorly. But it talks about like how to correctly introduce restorative practices. And literally, I was sitting there basically just like clapping, and the whole time I was like, yes, preach, like, you got it. And I'm going to talk about that, I think, in my next episode, because it is in the same vein of this one, and I think it'll go well together. But they had a statement in there, and these two educators are kind of in this podcast interviewed by Gonzalez, who is the woman who runs Cult of Pedagogy. But they're two restorative justice experts within the field. They've worked in that field, they've done trainings, they've hosted trainings, they've done the research, they know everything, right? And I'm going to just probably read this directly from the paper, because their quote basically says, right, like, we know that these solutions aren't working. As educators, as administrators, as counselors, we know that restorative practices aren't being implemented correctly in all places. We know that social emotional learning is not implemented correctly in all places. And we know multiculturalism training is not being implemented correctly in all places. So what they say is really powerful, and it's kind of like leaning into like this solution, right? It says, if you don't unpack the way that bias is present, racism is present, ableism is present, the way that you implement anything else is going to contain your bias, your racism, and your ableism. Basically saying that it's like, if we don't, as a school culture, look into the way that our biases are present, we will put those biases into the systems we implement. So when a school says, yeah, let's do restorative practices, but they don't talk about what limits their ability to do that, and they don't talk about their biases that limit them to do that, then those biases are then implemented within the system itself. So as they go to, try this new cool thing, they have all these biases that they don't know how to get past, and they're like, oh, it's not working. Like, why isn't it working? And then they get frustrated and they stop. And they stop implementing it because they're doing it wrong. I saw this in my old school, right? They weren't doing restorative practices with fidelity. And I can say that because I've read the books. I've done trainings. I have gone to multiple trainings over my first 4 or 5 years in education. I have read books in my master's program, my first master's program, my undergrad even talked about restorative practices a lot. And when they were implementing it, they're like, we're going to do this. And I was like, cool, please let me help. Did they let me help? Spoiler alert, they didn't, right? And they weren't doing it with fidelity, and that's a huge issue, because of course it doesn't work if you're not doing it correctly. And that's what this podcast is about. That's what, not my podcast, that's what the Cult of Pedagogy podcast was basically saying, and I just heavy retweet on all of that. I'm going to do an episode about it, so I'm not going to get on my soapbox about that. There's another thing that was a very specific article that is outlined in my resources that talks about this idea of transformative leadership, and counselors have a very specific role in the school system, right? Like as these kind of leaders. And the way that I described it was, when I think this was last semester, I was thinking about in grad school, your brain is going 1,000 miles per minute, and mine already does that. So it's my brain is just going 1,000,000 times a minute, right? So anyway, the idea in that class was to talk about the idea of a counselor as a leader. And I have this metaphor of so there are cogs in a system, right? We have those gears that kind of spin and interact in every way. And sometimes those gears get stuck and we have to jostle them a little bit to get them back in place. And my metaphor was that the counselors aren't a cog in the system. They are the oil that keeps the system running smoothly. And you have a student cog and an administrative cog, and you have a community cog, and you have parents as their own little gear, right? And all of these pieces are combined and oriented correctly because of the oil that the counselor puts into the system. And that is the true metaphor for what a counselor is, right? And that's the one that resonates with me the best, because I never understood what a counselor was. I thought it was just hey, let's prepare for graduation, let's do some social emotional shit, and it was just that. But counselors are so much more, and the fact that we don't necessarily see that within all the schools is a part of the problem as well. So think about counselors as the oil for this system of gears that is education. And that's what's really resonated with me. So this idea in this one article that no one really seems to be talking about, this is a 2017 article that talks about transformative leadership. And it's this idea of how do we notice that there is a need for change? How do we deconstruct everybody's frameworks? How do we address the power distribution that's inequitable? How do we show that there are good things happening, and then also say hey, there's some shitty things that are happening too? How do we show choice by everyone? How do we improve on equity and justice? How do we show awareness of our disconnectedness and our interconnectedness? How do we then critique and promise things to everyone within the system? How do we do this in a way that gives space for the courage it takes to do these things? And this idea of transformative leadership talks so much better about that than I just did. And it's kind of just, it's that moral courage piece that they talk about is this is a hard conversation to have, but in order to have counselors that make the difference they need to make, is they need to have this sense of courage to have they need to have courage to do these things, right? It is not an easy conversation. I already talked about that, right? So just transformative leadership is this guideline, these 8 tenets that they talk about, that basically says here's what you can do to make equitable change and rethink leadership towards advocacy and towards equity for all your students. And that's the way that we begin to oppose systemic oppression. And last but not least, and this is kind of where the paper kind of comes together, because I talked about in the title, I talked about the idea of opposing systemic racism through the IEP process. And if you guys know anything about special education and the IEP process, basically it's 95% data. I would argue 100, but it's not really 100%. It's 95% data. And the way that if you're doing an IEP correctly, and if your special education team is well trained in how to do an IEP correctly, it's 95% data. We're pulling data from general education courses. We're pulling data from standardized tests. We're pulling data from their career tests. We're pulling data from literally every place we can pull data from our own tests that we do. And when we look at that data, when we sit with a student of color within an IEP meeting and we notice that their data is saying like, hey, maybe they don't need to be here, but then a teacher argues that, oh no, they need the extra support. And it's like, okay, well, prove it. Prove it to me in this data. Point it out to me, right? And it's this conversation through data that allows people to really begin to see like the inherent bias in the system, right? It's like when I would go to credit recovery conversations and have conversations that say like, why is 80% of the students needing credit recovery? Why are 80% of them students of color? And it's through those conversations that the counselor can then say like, we need to have a conversation about this. How do we have a conversation about this? And the important piece of transformative leadership and the important piece about counseling leadership is going into conversations and saying like, here's what the data says and here's what we need to do about it. And then the problem is, right, the last couple lines of my paper in this small 4-page paper that I've talked about for fucking 25 minutes. In this small 4-page paper, the last 2 sentences go like this. I'm going to read the last 4 sentences just because they're good. So it says, IEP data proves this oppression. IEP data accentuates a need for cultural change. However, to change the culture of your school, every single person you can get in that room needs to be in that room. Only then, with a clear community-centered mandate for educational equity and exploration of biases, can counselors move their system towards equitable advocacy. And that's what it comes down to, is we need to get every person in the community into that room so that we can have an open conversation about our biases and about our inequities that we are promoting as the system. And it's only in that moment that we can lead a conversation towards change. Just going to let that linger for a second. In the effort of not jumping back onto my soapbox, I think I've run through everything that matters from my side that I've kind of putting into the conversation, like my personal experience, the paper that I wrote, all of these different ideas that like come from my side. And, you know, with the effort of not making this podcast, it's already been an hour. So not for the effort of not making this podcast, you know, for 2 hours, because I could. And if you're interested in hearing me yap more about it, please follow along. Please leave a comment. Please do something, because that just tells me that it works, right? So in an effort to wrap this up a little bit, and I'm going to post this in the description, there was a bunch of resources that I did not collate, but that a bunch of people who responded to my video, who, you know, are interested in this the same way that I am, who care about this topic the same way that I do, they gave a bunch of resources. If you are interested in, you know, exploring more about this, if you're interested in having conversations with your school and with your admin, if you're interested in doing these things, if you just are interested because you want to do the research, I collated a bunch of resources from those people. Basically what it is I have like a chart that explores like topics, resources for that topic, and then like research angles. So like basically guiding questions towards what do these resources answer as far as research, and like what are the things could we look into. So you'll see on the resource itself, and I also put it on my Teachers Pay Teachers if you're on there for free. Like I'm not trying to get money out of this. That's kind of shitty to like say like, oh, we need to have conversations about this very important issue, but first give me $5. Like I don't know, it just felt icky to me. And I have stuff on Teachers Pay Teachers, but I have like a whole moral disengagement with like Teachers Pay Teachers, because it's like, just give it to me for free. Like we're all poor. Like I don't know. Anyway, I know I'm a hypocrite because I have things posted on there that people pay for, but like anyway, it's for free right now. This particular conversation is for free. This particular resource that I'm providing is for free. So you can, when you click on it, you'll see like across the top it says topics, resources, and research angles. I'm going to go through kind of like the topics, and then I'm not going to go through all of the different books necessarily, but I am going to talk about some of the ones towards the bottom that are just like bigger conversations for research, because I think that's the important part of this conversation. If you are interested, there are a bunch of books, there are a bunch of like articles you can look at that do talk about this. And that's just a good place to start, is that resource. So topics on the left that people have like given resources about are the school to prison pipeline, which is basically this concept that like students are prepared for prison and are directly going to prison because of the systems that are in place in schools. And there's 3 books in there. We talk about education and race educational theory. There was Paulo Freire, who is a educational theorist from a long time ago. Basically, like set up the foundation for like public education in a lot of ways. He's not the only one. There's a lot of them. And the pedagogy of the oppressed talks about this education and race educational theory. And then we have this like bigger category, which is culturally responsive education. And culturally responsive education is talking about how do we as educators and teachers and administrators, how do we respond to, how do we teach and have conversations about different cultures and how are we responding to them in the correct way, right? And there's a bunch of books on that one, so I'm obviously not going to read all of those, but there's lots of good conversations there. And I honestly think that's the best place to start, because I think that's where the core of this issue, that's like where the core of the issue is that like you can address right now as a teacher, right, is within culturally responsive teaching practices, right? As we continue, there's a big category on Black girls in education, and like I said before, that like triple oppression that kind of happens to that group of students, and there's a lot of conversations about like Black girls specifically and their education and how that is it's highly problematic. There's a couple resources for the history of education, just talking about the school system itself, where it came from, and how it became the place that it is, how it became the system that it is. Another one that, honestly, there could be more about this, because I think this is a big one for restorative practices, and I think this is a big one for like how to help a lot of students, but trauma-informed teaching and practices. There's a lot of conversations about what trauma-informed education looks like and interventions to use there. So there's a couple of resources for that one. And then there is a few resources for this topic of systemic racism and oppression. So these are specifically about how public education has become the thing that it is, and has become this, system that is literally just mainstreaming oppression, basically. And there's a few resources there for that. The last one is kind of what the topic of my paper is about, is the race and disability connection, meaning like why are students of color more often in special education. There are 3 specific books about that, and then 2 specific books and a podcast that have some more resources for you guys on that if you're interested. But those are like the big topics. So if you are, like I said, if you are interested in this conversation that I'm having, that I'm yapping about, that I'm jumping on my soapbox about, that I'm getting so passionately engaged and yapping so much about, then these are good places for you to start. I'm obviously open for conversation, and that's like the whole point of this forum, right? Is to say like, hey, please talk to me about it, because I want to talk about it. And the thing I really wanted to talk about was just like ideas and topics and other potential resources for further research, and that's the idea that is in the bottom, right? And a bottom of my resource. And these things are probably things that have resources. I didn't have any from my particular like TikTok comment section, right? Because all of these are literally just from like other teachers in the community that cared enough to comment. But these are other topics we can talk about, right? Like the adultification of Black children, the coded language within behavioral expectations. There's the Jane Elliott did a presentation, did an experiment about like blue-eyed versus brown-eyed children, and talking about like segregation and the systemic impact of that. There's a couple of court cases on here that talk about how students were not receiving proper services and were wrongly placed and misrepresented in special education. So those are really interesting. Rick Roscoe is a research advocate for the impact of racism in education. And then Notes from the Field by Anne DeVere Smith is basically a documentary about her experiences and like 200 other teachers that she interviewed in experimenting with this idea about their experiences of the school to prison pipeline. So she has a one-woman play, a book, there's a documentary, there's like a video about it, there's a whole ton of stuff. And all of this is available through like this resource that I made. So if you guys want more research points, this has linked things to all the books. I linked all the resources to an Amazon link mostly that says like, here's where you can buy the book, here's where you can learn more about it. And then some more places for research. If you have more resources, I also put a link on there to a Google form that will automatically tell me when a resource is added, so I can like blast that out to the community. And the idea there is just like, hey, if we really truly do want to keep talking about this, then please send me more resources, because that allows us to continue the conversation in a way that promotes ethical research and supports us not just yapping about our opinions, but also showing up with facts, right? Because in this day and age, like, people need backing. Like, you need to have some sort of backing to even have this conversation. So the more resources that you have, please share them. I'm going to share this form out. It's definitely going to be in the description of this podcast, but it's also, like I said, going to be on my Teachers Pay Teachers. I'm going to talk about it on my TikTok. I'm about to make a video for my TikTok, kind of like promoting this episode and then promoting that resource that I just created. So with that, I think my camera zoomed out again. So if you are on YouTube, you can see my cat. He's literally in the corner. So anyway, I think that does everything I wanted it to do in this episode. Sorry, I got a little yappy. I got a little preachy in there, but like I said, these conversations are essential to keep happening. And if I'm the one that needs to start that conversation, that's what Kassick's Corner is about. And I keep trying to advocate for that, right? Like I've gained a handful of new followers since like my podcast ended season 1 in March. And I think it's exciting to see that the community is growing a little bit. It's also super scary. Like there's a lot of pressure in some ways, and it's not even 700 people, but the fact that almost 700 people have like subscribed to listen to me and care enough about the system in general to say like, hey, yeah, like let's follow this guy and see what's going on. Like that's an insane amount of pressure, but an insane amount of just like pride in the fact that like we can create a community anywhere. And the idea is this community specifically, Kassick's Corner is this little like corner of the internet, right? And I accentuated this in my classroom, and I hope to continue to accentuate this in my classroom. Is it's like this little corner of the internet that like feels safe to have these conversations, if even just for yourself, and if even just to promote that you're not alone in this, and to promote that there is someone else who agrees with you, and to promote that there is someone who cares about the same things you do. And I think that's what I'm hoping to provide, right? Like a literal corner of the internet where we can come and complain about things, we can come to celebrate things, and we can come to just like engage in this passion that we all have. And I think someday it's going to be a little bit bigger than it is now. And I like I said, that kind of scares me, but that's the goal, right? So as we wrap up this episode, I did just want to say like, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. I'm super proud of you and all the work that you're doing. Trust me, I know it's not easy. And if you've listened to this for over an hour, then thank you so much. You're my hero. Please leave a comment, review, slide into my DMs. Y'all know they're wide open. I always be saying that. Maybe someday it won't be true, but here we are. So thank you so much for listening. I'm super proud of you, and I hope to see you in the next one.